Have you been wondering how to build a successful strategy with open source for your company? Or why would you invest in open source projects when you can use the code for free? Are you an open source maintainer on the edge of burnout? Or a newcomer who's too intimidated to take the first steps and get involved? Maybe you're not a code developer and you think that there's no place for you in the open source ecosystem. You're not alone. My name is Ildiko Vancha, and this is the My Open Source Experience podcast, where my guests and I share our open source journeys with all the successes, the struggles, and joyful moments. Find the answers to your questions and dilemmas, and more importantly, join us and be part of the community. In this segment, Ariel Jolo talks about why and how he transitioned the sysadmin appreciation day in Argentina into the sysarmy community. You were able to organize these events once a year for 3 years when you got to the point that you said that there seems to be a community forming. So what were you doing at the time to create and start building this community other than the yearly events, which is not a lot in terms of when we talk about community of people who keep in touch and get something out of being in a community?
Yeah, exactly. So after the 3 years of running the this one-off event and realizing, okay, people need something else than this event, that's when the idea like got to me, like, okay, maybe we should do something that's every day, all day long. So again, this was 2012, so IRC was still a thing. So I started the IRC channel. So I already got like people email addresses and everything. And so I don't quite remember how I did it, but probably got people to join the IRC and saying like, hey, we're starting like this community. It's a community, and going back to what we were saying about how to treat people, this is a community that's agnostic. Here we are not here to discuss which this Linux distribution is best, which text editor is best, if you are using a proprietary software or not, or whatever. Like, you do you. This is a community for people that work in tech, and the name of the community is still, like, to this day, is sysarmy, because it's a pun on sysadmin. And when I was working at this big company, we'll call this the sysadmin groups like the army, because it was a self-imposed name. So like sysarmy made a lot of sense as a name, and this is a community for system administrators back then. Nowadays, I think we are the like not many of us are still like sysadmins. Most of the community members are developers or people that are in data science, or I don't know, other areas, networking, security, databases.
DevOps, I guess, and all the new fancy terms for things.
Exactly. They have evolved. They are SREs and platform engineers and everything. But core sysadmins, as I was back in the day, not so many. But again, the way I started the community was through IRC. And we also had like a Facebook page and a Twitter page and Identica page. And we will try to like put out like the articles or share articles that were really interesting for us, like for the core of the community. But then we slowly realized that people, all they really wanted were like memes and jokes and things that related to them, but they didn't want any other like source. Like, everybody has their own sources to learn things. They weren't looking for the source to learn new things necessarily. They were looking a place to vent or to be with others that understand them. So actually, our motto is support for those who need support, because it's a community where you will like tech unite us, but we would really talk about everything and anything that's not tech per se. We got people that got new jobs because of the community, people that are living abroad because of the community, people that got married that found their spouses through the community. So a lot of these magical things because happens because of the community.
So it was a bit of a social gathering for people who worked in a particular area of tech, a little bit of an outlet. And I mean, when I imagine let's say, quote unquote traditional sysadmin, and they are in a big data center or in a dark room without a window with a lot of servers that are noisy, and it sounds a little bit of a lonely job in a way. And the other experience that I do have, not necessarily with always sysadmins, but those people who are operating infrastructure, software and hardware infrastructure. And whenever you get them to a room, and no matter what mission the session has, it always turns into sharing quote unquote war stories. So they are the people who have a lot of things happening to them, and obviously they meet people when they need something because something is broken. They're already frustrated, and it's tough. So like a big chunk of the time is always people sharing what went wrong, what's not working, and just really, you know, get that frustration out of their heads. And I always feel like that's just the most helpful sometimes that you can do, to provide a forum where they can come together with others who totally understand their frustration, what happened to them, why. Maybe they have a similar story, and then everyone feels that, okay, it isn't just happening to me. And then at one point, sometimes they can also figure out what went wrong in one place and what the solution is for that if the person hasn't found it yet. But a really big chunk of these gatherings, even with the most, you know, clear mission and technical goal and whatever, it's like just that social aspect of the gathering. And it sounds like that you created this space for people where they could be with others who understand them.
Spot on. I couldn't have put it better. It's exactly that. And again, like these videos that went viral, they went viral because of that. That's how we framed it, and that's how we characterized the sysadmins and the thing that we were suffering. And it is true in many cases, and it was my own experience. From 2013, from January 2013 to January 2014, I worked for this company, and I was the only sysadmin in a 300-person company. And I was on call for a whole year, 365 days and nights. And actually, the community is what really got me through that. And I would like go on IRC during like business hours and ask people like, "Hey, I'm having this problem. It's not working." People would help me, and of course, I would try to help others. But people still show around that I created sysadmin because I needed it, and it is true. I needed it. I needed a community of people that could help me, and that wasn't distracted about the Linux distribution that I use or didn't use, or the text editor or whatever. And the other thing that we started doing right off, and this was like again the magic of the community, it started to happen that we got together every 2 weeks to have like in-person beers. Again, not talks, not meetups. Meetups weren't a thing back then. I'm talking earlier than that. So we go to this bar and we had a table, and people would show up, and then we had another table, and suddenly we were like occupying and modifying the whole layout of the bar because there were probably like 50, 60 people around, and going to have smoke outside or like moving the things around. And again, tech was the common driver, but it wasn't all about tech.
I totally understand, and it like we always say, like said a lot of times on this podcast too, that when it comes to open source, like when someone starts a project, for example, it's usually to scratch their own itch. I think is what people in English say, because I'm also not a native English speaker, but I think that is the term that we most often use, and it sounds like that you also did have an itch, but you really wasn't the only one in the area. In this segment, Michael Dexter talks about the Beehive community and the things that were essential for its growth. You mentioned the community around that hypervisor, which I think was started buy a storage company or something along those lines. And the community is named Beehive, and it is spelled very differently. The name will be in the description below. And I think, if I remember correctly, when you mentioned the community briefly, you said that you were the first person who reached out who wasn't working for the vendor company who created the hypervisor initially. And then you put in a lot of work to build a community. Can you talk a little bit about how your like initial interaction was with the people who created the project, and then what it took to get involved and also do this community building activity around it?
It is a fascinating one, and I'm grateful to you for helping me reflect on it, because I've just been on autopilot, kind of on the banana peel, sliding along for like a decade now. So there were some happy accidents. There was a developer summit session unveiling it. And I walked in and I didn't know you had to register separately for that and even pay a little for lunch, even though I wasn't eating their lunch. And so I, having spent some time with NetBSD Zen, as I mentioned, and I contracted someone to develop sysjail on OpenBSD for want of a container, I was highly motivated and like sitting down to Unix in the first place. The moment someone said, hey, we've got a native hypervisor, I instantly latched on. I just realized that the conversation that produced that took place about a year earlier at an event that's no longer with us, Meet BSD, where it was a pure unconference, and we thought, okay, let's all get in a circle and discuss a topic. And we broke the rules on unconference, and we didn't split out into groups, and we discussed our hypervisor options. And for licensing reasons, there was no option to bring in the established ones, be it KVM, be it Zen, and that would be hard to produce a new one, etc. So through the evolution of hardware, luckily the hardware acceleration for hypervisors was just arriving. I had very little awareness of that, but Beehive happened to be a very, very simple minimalistic hypervisor that leveraged heavily newfangled features like VirtIO and hardware acceleration built into every CPU. That's now taken for granted. That's just the norm now. But back then, I wrote down the name, which even had painful camel capitalization for part of it, spelling out Beehive hypervisor, capital B, capital H, capital. It was like, oh, painful. But that finally went away to just the lowercase utility name. So it was a month or two later, I emailed the developers just out of the blue, like, that sounded really cool. How do I give it a try? And they're like, well, it's not ready for prime time, but here's how you do it. And it was a very raw technology, and had, I won't go deep into the limitations there, but let's just say a guest would be burning up your CPU core at 100%, because that's just, that was the shortest path, was to produce a minimally viable hypervisor, and they achieved that. So there were pretty strict hardware requirements, there were strict configuration requirements, and it was a really cool parlor trick. It made a little virtual machine that was by developers for developers. At that point, it was a great development tool if you were building an OS, but for a user who's accustomed to a big proprietary solution for virtualizing things, not to name names, it was absolutely not for them. So step one was to write an article about it, hands-on Beehive. I stepped through and like, here's how you can too give it a try, with all the disclosures that no, this is not ready for prime time. It's kind of primitive. It will disappoint you in some ways, but it does some things really well, and it's fundamentally reliable. It's simple. It's a few hundred K of software leveraging the heck out of a CPU feature. So the article gave way to many talks on the subject. And I like to think back, I was just, how do they say, screaming from the bell tower, hey, it's a thing, check it out. it now does this. It now does this. It now has Linux guest support. It now has Breakthrough. It has Windows guest support. That was in Stockholm. I announced that. And I worked with the developers to just play genuinely dumb user on how to make it work. And they were very patient with me. They were excited to have the interest, and it was a good relationship for quite some time to get it off the ground. It was fascinating. It was a complete eye opener for me. It leveraged everything I knew about storage and partitioning and disk images and all the things to build a synthetic machine, because you have to pretty much bring it all to the table manually. I had fortunately done some of that with my previous hypervisor work, and so I knew about disk images and converting them, manipulating them, doing all the things for hygiene you have to do. And interest grew, and a colleague eventually needed it for passing a graphics card to a Linux VM for transcoding. And suddenly there was a real world use case where a completely free BSD shop could have the one Linux thing contained in that manner, and it met their exact needs. And in time, the next big breakthrough was a series of the talks are online from Jason Tubner in Australia, who works with social services and could not afford certain solutions and was not pleased with the highly discounted proprietary solutions. And for social services, which means like a data center in a Australian town is literally a metal shed, he found a perfect use case of the fundamental OS with ZFS as the platform, OpenBSD virtualized for the long haul tunnel, and virtualized Windows to monitor those printer supply levels, which is a ridiculously mundane use case, but it was the right tool for each job. And for me, that was the kind of crossroads of like, wow, this is finally a very useful technology. And that same person commented that this has the best support of anything ever, simply because we jump on chat, whatever platform, and get answers from the developer. And it probably helps that at least two of them are Australian and they do their thing. And it was magical. And I'll keep using that phrase because, I mean, compare that to any engagement with any vendor ever. You just don't get that access. You don't get that amazing functionality for potentially no cost. It just proved to me that, okay, we did it. We pulled it off. Free software can genuinely compete, and you can follow the evolution of like what needs to happen to make it super user friendly. And I've hosted a call since like 2018 on that very topic. Okay, what has to happen? And that gets back to the occasional fundraising, like adding features. Recently, TPM emulation. That's a trusted TPM. Yeah, the compute little security module in most laptops and some servers, et cetera, et cetera. So I like the formality of a conference talk. And one of those three conferences I mentioned earlier requires a paper or a semblance of a paper. And I think that formality is really good because it forces me, at least, to put my thoughts together in a very clear way. It is the antithesis of an IRC chat. It is a very formal, structured argument. And I was a CS minor. I was a religious studies major. I was in it for getting my writing good, and that's been invaluable in exactly that. Writing a conference paper is very much a writing skill, especially a conference talk, a blog post. Those, you need full words, you need them to add up, they need to do their thing. One skill, as I mentioned, and I keep mentioning, if a user could truly be enabled to do bug reports, a skill that's definitely helped the Beehive hypervisor is the ability to write a conference proposal, which I realized years on is not very different than writing a bug report or a feature request proposal, here's the code. You have to show your work, you have to argue your case, you have to be clear. You need a title that explains it all right there. You know, a higher performance version of this thing that everyone knows is slow. That gets attention right off the bat, and then you work into the prioritization of the facts as needed, the important ones, and just that top down. There are various ways of doing that. That applies to everything in technology, and it's a non-technical skill, and people really need to work on it. And so having the conferences formalize it for me, and even articles and blog posts rather than a 100 and something character post, if you know what I mean, I think was invaluable. And it's a level of, for lack of a better term, professionalism that is not kind of implicit with a CD containing an open source operating system. The CD, I suppose, is a professional effort. That maybe in that regard, it's a bad example. A tarball sitting in your downloads directory that's just often lacking the polish of documentation of truly what to do, documentation of what to do, and do something meaningful in your use case. So looking back at Beehive, a fundamental challenge on this, like 500 kilobytes of software, is that it is stunningly complex with very few subject matter experts and ridiculously large security risks. You can have anytime a little guest operating system runs the risk of completely owning the host through the, as I think Theodore put it, the fragility of x86 virtualization. That is a truly challenging proposal. And if it's not obvious, I'm not a kernel developer. I could not sit down and truly improve much in Beehive, and I argue I almost didn't, but I did, through testing, get it released in what was FreeBSD 10 back in like 2010, rather than 11 or 12 or some future version. I just sped up the process, nothing more. And that outreach sped up the process, because we can all work in isolation for the rest of our lives. And famously, people have had their own forks of FreeBSD and they passed away, and none of us know what magic they did. And we knew they were really smart. And check out Temple OS when you have a chance. It will show that people can go down very fascinating paths in unique, wonderful isolation. So I hope that helps in explaining how a community can go from zero, literally zero, one user, to actual corporate users from very informed participants. I mean, these were FreeBSD experts who happened to use it effectively, and the developers latched onto it very early on as a development platform, because if you know you will panic something and you can save yourself the time of a hardware reboot, great. And that's even seen some really big progress from a Linux survivor who's joined our community, who pretty much has a user-facing transparent hypervisor and is testing file systems, and you can just kill the process, Control-C, and it's not even obvious to the user that it's a hypervisor. But that's where the sheer flexibility of anything that's truly open is your friend. And it has to be open to do that. You can't request a vendor to offer that feature and maybe have it in 3 years. You hopefully have the ability to scratch an itch over a long weekend and have a new ability. So the paradox continues to do amazing things.
In this segment, Shuah Khan talks about the diversity strategy in the Linux kernel mentorship program and the framework that it is using. I remember walking up to the person who became my mentor in OpenStack at a conference. So I think utilizing events are crucial. I also remember that, for example, in the OpenStack community, we used to have a group called Women of OpenStack, and then it transitioned into a diversity and inclusion working group. Do you have any any programs like these in the kernel community, or even as part of maybe your mentorship program that are focusing on, minority groups, underrepresented groups in any regard?
So there are a couple of initiatives, I think. Generally, I mean, Linux Foundation does events group does a lot of that outreach, right? So they will offer diversity, offer scholarships for minorities to be able to come and and come to the conferences and attend conferences and such. So initiative wise, we and the mentorship program itself, we don't necessarily say, okay, so there are other mentorship programs. There is the outreachy, that is, you only find, they only take the um, women and non-binary. We didn't want to do that. We wanted inclusivity. We defined inclusivity more broadly, diversity more broadly, because the kernel community is primarily men. We also do not have participation from other parts of the globe, men or women. So we defined that a little more, we look at it more broadly, that we are offering this learning opportunity to everybody. Anybody can take advantage of the opportunity. And it so happens we do get a lot of interest from Asia Pacific, and we're seeing a lot more in Eastern Europe these days. Eastern meaning some of the European countries as well, not just Eastern Europe, but European countries, and then Japan, Korea, and those China especially, and they have other challenges. So that's why I defining broadly helps, because they have other challenges as a minority. That is a challenge, could be a challenge. And then the other challenge is language barrier, meaning English not being the native language. It's harder for them. They are technically solid, they have great technical skills, and they are great engineers. However, it can be a lot more intimidating for them. It can be men or women. So we defined it more broadly. So we offer that as a broader program than specifically for a gender based.
In this segment, Brett Chamberlain talks about the strategies to grow and sustain the Chapel open source community. You mentioned community building. I'm curious, like over the course of the project's life, which spans over 20 years, um, do you remember what things you did to support community building? Because I assume that either at the beginning or over time there was a need, like regardless of how many people and where they are from in the community, to do activities that really gives it a community feel, that helps people to work easier and closer to each other, better with each other, and also try to grow the community and yeah, foster the community that you had.
Yeah. So we definitely have gone through pretty big differences and changes in terms of how much effort we put into community building and community structure. In the early years, we did very little, and I think there are two reasons for that. One is, as we've talked about, we had a ton of work to do and to prove our case, and so it just, like, we couldn't even imagine, I think, putting resources into it. But the other thing is we sort of had a built-in community. So I've talked about the DARPA HPCS program that is, the program that spawned this language, this project. I haven't talked much about, in those early milestone reviews where we would show up and talk about what we were doing, when people hear DARPA, they might just think sort of, defense agencies, DoD. But it was a really wide tent. So the Department of Energy was there, NOAA was there, EPA was there. So sort of anybody in the government who used computing was encouraged to come to these and give their 2 cents. And so we sort of had this built-in community through those milestone reviews and the program structure itself, where we sort of, we knew these were the people that were funding us that we were trying to make successful and more productive. And we knew we had their attention. And so there wasn't really a lot of drive or need for community building, if you will. And I think it was as the HPCS program was winding down that we started thinking about, like, okay, well, what's next? And how do we grow, and how do we find new users? And so it was kind of during those years that we did things like design a logo, for example, happened in 2011. We put out a call to the community and to Cray employees saying, like, hey, whenever people ask us for a logo, we just give them chapel in Times Roman font or something like that, right? We really need a logo. And we had like 100 entries come in, and we voted on them and had the executives at Cray vote on them, and had a clear winner. So that was kind of a baby step towards community. And from that, we developed our first swag, because now we had a logo we could slap onto things, and we passed around USB sticks, and then in later years, microfiber cloths and bags. And my favorite was we did a series of fortune cookies where the fortunes were things like, we see productive parallel programming in your future, and it had the chapel logo and stuff like that.
I love that.
So that was kind of, again, late 2010, 2011's kind of a couple other big steps we did in 2014, which was probably a year or two after the HPCS program wound down. We held our first, we started our first social media accounts. And wait, let me see if I get the timing right here. Yeah, it was around that time. Yeah, 2014. We held our first, our first dedicated community workshop or conference, depending on what you want to call it. A few years prior to that, we had started a happy hour at Supercomputing, which again is this large, massive convention that's kind of the center of the HPC world every year. It's happening this week, in fact. I'm sitting it out this year. And for a few years, we had this get together at Supercomputing. We would just sort of invite people to show up at a bar and talk about Chapel. And I don't even think we offered to buy their drinks, because we didn't really have a budget, and there are all sorts of ethical questions about that and stuff. So it was basically just like, come hang out with us and talk Chapel. And we called it Chug, the Chapel Users Group, which probably would raise HR concerns today. And it was sort of a playoff of CUG, which is the Cray Users Group, which is a well-established, very big workshop and annual conference that goes on to this day. So we did Chug for a few years, and we're like, okay, well, we should do an actual conference or workshop where people can present papers and things. And we're trying to come up with a name for it. And I'm terrible at naming things, but this is one of the things I was happiest with. We called it Chew, because I liked Chug and Chew as kind of complementary names. And it was spelled CHIUW, and it stood for the Chapel Implementers and Users Workshop. And so that ran for about 10 years. And a couple years ago, we rebranded it to Chapel Con, because nobody ever knew what Chew actually meant, or most people didn't even get the joke anymore. So now it's called Chapel Con. And that continues to be, as far as community building and sort of synchronizing with the community, that continues to be one of our biggest events, where we get people to submit talks and papers and to present them. We also do tutorials and interactive coding sessions and things. And ever since COVID, we've been doing it in a completely virtual setting to just completely reduce barriers to participation. It's a free event. And so, anybody who's curious about Chapel or productive parallel computing, we encourage to come check out ChapelCon each year. This year that happened about a month ago now, and we've just put up all of the talks and slides from that up online. So if people want to sort of revisit it virtually, that's a possibility as well.
Like communities where I've been participating and in and working with, it is always a process when it comes to building trust. So for these communities, the maintaining or growing the community size, and not just the size, but also diversity of all sorts. That includes organizational diversity as well. That is very important, and that can give you a lot of things. And one of those, for the projects where I've been active in, that is to make sure that there is no one organization that controls the direction of the project. So, like if you think about software like OpenStack, which is a large cloud platform, an open source cloud platform, there are companies who are creating distributions of OpenStack and selling it. Other companies are running it as public cloud. Other companies are using it as a private cloud. So, in terms of what features make it into the platform, how the APIs look like, which bugs get fixed first. If there is one company who's in charge of all that, then they can easily take the development and design of the software to a direction that messes with some of the other users use cases and experience, and they might not be able to use the platform at all at the end. So for a project like OpenStack, it is a driving factor for companies, especially, to get involved and make sure that they are able to be part of the governance, the technical governance, just to make sure that the project goes into a direction that is beneficial for them as well as others in that ecosystem. And it kind of sounds like that when it comes to at least maybe the programming language space, this is a little bit less of a driver.
I don't know. I think the analogies you bring up hold for us as well. So, one of our goals from the beginning has been to make sure that Chapel can run on any parallel computer, and so we didn't want it to be like a language that resulted in cray lock-in or HPE lock-in. And I remember one of our early sort of triumphs was we showed up at Supercomputing, which is our big annual conference, and had results not only on the Cray systems of the time, but on Sun systems and IBM systems, who were at that time developing their own languages that we were competing with. And so we were like, not only do we run on our platform, we run on your platforms as well. That said, by virtue of the fact that we worked for Cray, we obviously spent a lot more time making sure it worked and worked well on Cray systems. And ultimately, like, for the language to be maximally successful, you would want it to run its best on every vendor's systems, and then to develop the best systems so that people would buy, your system, your Cray systems, right? So that's definitely been, that's on our mind when we think about having more of a community effort is, so Cray and HPE, when we build systems, we're building systems out of parts from a lot of vendors. We use Intel processors, AMD processors, NVIDIA GPUs, AMD GPUs. And so we're always making sure we're portable across those things. But, the more vendors that are involved, the better we'll probably do on their chips or their networks. And ultimately, as the supercomputing market seems very HPE dominated in recent years, but as there's more diversity of supercomputers, and I guess this is probably taking a United States focused view, internationally there are many alternatives. Like having our code run well on those vendors' systems is going to be important as well. And having those vendors cooperating with that effort would help. So I definitely agree that we would benefit as a community with broader diversity, as you're saying, organizational diversity in terms of the governing board and in terms of merging. And you reminded me along the way there of something we've talked about for dealing with this trust thing is you can imagine that if, taking the example of other vendors, if other vendors had testing resources that they were also committing to the pool and were running code on nightly, that sort of would be a way of establishing trust. Like, it's not just running on our systems, but on yours as well. And obviously we could be clever and say, like, if I'm on the HPE system, do bad thing X, right? But hopefully we're assuming most people are good actors, and hopefully we can screen out the bad actors before we reach that point. But that's one thing we've talked about. I want to go back. You mentioned, that this problem of trust and testing resources is not unique to us. I definitely agree. And I think there are things we can learn from the community. I think the one thing that is a little bit challenging is, and I don't want to understate anyone's technology, but for us, supercomputers, even within HPE, we have a small number of supercomputers that I can count on my fingers. So it's not as though we could take a supercomputer and move it outside of the firewall just for Chapel's sake, because lots and lots of different teams use them and run things on them. And that's the thing I think is a little bit harder than a commodity house where it's oh yeah, let's just put some Windows systems outside the network or some Macs or whatever. Putting a supercomputer sort of in its own place is a much bigger investment and not something I could rationalize with a straight face to anyone. So that's the piece that feels different and tricky here, which is not to say there aren't paths forward, and again, lessons we can learn from other communities. But it's the thing that feels most challenging and unique here to me that sort of makes me scratch my head and really think about this.
I mean, it sounds like that it would be um, great in the supercomputing ecosystem if the participating companies were able to find a way to share this burden of how to actually test what you're developing. And it sounds like that is maybe something that now that Chapel is at the HPSF Foundation, that you will be able to work on. In this segment, Engin Kayraklioglu talks about his experiences of learning and navigating upstream processes used by open source communities like Chapel. In terms of your involvement in the community, like obviously you have a mentor. By the way, did you have one person who was assigned to you as a mentor, or the internship program was more structured around the fact that you will meet multiple people from the community and then they will help you?
Probably somewhere in the middle. The person with whom I worked together for a week, Michael, was my mentor and was my go-to person to ask technical question or directions, if you will. Like I'm stuck, which way do I go? But it's not like I just interact with Michael and Michael interacts with the rest of the community on behalf of me or anything like that. It was more like my lifeline, if you will, like the person to ask questions, because I don't know what others' expertise are. So I don't know, like I have this question, but I don't know who to ask even. So, hey, Michael, I have this question, and then he would, just talk to him and talk to her and stuff like that. So I think that was kind of the nature of the relationship. And following that, I become more part of the bigger team and interacting with others and things like that.
Do you remember how much help you needed with like the community structure and processes and dynamics, and how I interact with the bigger group compared to just the technical questions that I'm working on this particular task or feature and I got stuck somewhere, so you go and ask your mentor Michael or someone else in the community?
I think the process aspect of that was a bigger challenge for me back then. I don't want to say challenge, but I've been a silent user, as I said. I know the code relatively well. I know where things are. I know how to write Chapel code or underlying C code and whatever. But so I want to change some documentation. I saw a typo in documentation, for example. It's a really trivial, non-technical task, right? But like you have to create a branch, you have to create a pull request, you have to test it this way, that way, you have to get that branch merged in, reviewed. So this whole process that exists for different projects in different shapes or forms, like getting used to that was, I don't say overwhelming, but there's a big procedure, right? Like even though I worked with Git in the past, it was very rudimentary just to make sure that I don't lose anything and stuff like that. But now I'm doing all these complicated tasks, creating pull requests for the first time in my life, even though I was just looking at the GitHub pages and pull requests for years. Now I'm just making my own. So that was a little bit, that was where mentorship really helped me as well. Like one aspect of that was that, like not technical questions, but getting the feel of how to contribute to an open source project for the first time for me.
Do you remember like your first contributions? Like you mentioned typo fix in a documentation. That sounds trivial-ish, but I wonder, like either that or any other contribution that you were making, or bug reports, or when you were doing something in the community. Do you remember if you still felt any of that intimidation or like the challenge of, now I'm submitting a change in the form of a pull request in case of Chapel, and everybody's going to see it, and what if it's not correct, what if it's not written nicely, or whatever things that you might have been concerned about. Do you remember any of that experience?
Not particularly, but I wouldn't be surprised if I didn't get a good sleep at night after my first code change. Like what if things explode? What if like it was terrible? Like we have nightly testing. We had nightly testing back then too, but like what if I wake up and see a bunch of test failures because of my PR? Like how can I make peace with that? And so like that nervousness, I'm pretty sure like caused me a good night's sleep after my first PR. Honestly, it still happens to some extent if I merge something big and potentially consequential on a tight deadline or something like that. But that's just part of the thrill, if you if you will. And of course, that nervousness goes away after the first PR that you get merged, um, to a good extent, at least. But some of it is healthy, because it shows that you're a responsible person and you want to do a good job. And what if you break people's code and give them a headache? I think the key point to remember that, like for those who are just starting, is it still happens. Like I still make silly mistakes. I still annoy people probably because I make silly mistakes and suddenly the development branch is broken and stuff like that. It happens. You just have to be responsible and clean up after yourself. I think that's all that matters here.
That is very true. I mean, I don't write code that much anymore, but I still do create pull requests and changes if someone is using Garrett, then Garrett reviews, and there are still documentation and procedural things that you can mess up. It's just so easy. I'm a community manager, so I work with open source communities and I work with maintainers, and then some people are just so laid back. Yeah, if it doesn't work, we will just revert it. So with the version control and Git, what you put in, you can just as well take it out. Yeah, sometimes you need to do a little bit of polishing after taking something out, but still the option is there. So the way how it got merged, it can also be reverted and like it never happened almost. So that's reassuring, but remembering, for example, when I got started, it's really not the laid back way of thinking about that. On one hand, you're new, so you don't want anything that you create to be merged and then reverted because, well, it didn't really work out after all. Or also, like, as you say, that I don't want to see a lot of test failures in the morning. And then, yeah, like all the other things. I do remember sitting with my colleague and we were staring at the laptop because once I hit the push it up for review button, and I'm like, oh, what's gonna happen now? So at one point we just looked at each other, like it was my name on the patch, and I'm like, well, I guess we just have to see what happens from here, and just need that, I don't know, 5-10 seconds of courage when you will be like, I'm gonna push the button and then I'm going to deal with whatever comes afterward. And with that, that's all, folks. That was our episode for today. What did resonate with you the most? What new ideas, strategy, or useful tips did you hear today? Or you have a comment or follow-up question to ask? Comment on the episode below or start a conversation on your favorite social media platform. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the podcast so others can discover it too. And stay tuned because the next episode is just around the corner.